How do you make decisions on what to leave out in a painting? How do you simplify the scene? What considerations do you have for composition, making a pleasing composition? So I'm going to cover all of these questions in this watercolor demonstration, and the subject is going to be the island of Mykonos. In fact, this will be part one of a three-part series of paintings based on this island. Hello, I'm Tim Wilmot, a watercolor painter, and I produce full-length video tutorials with commentary, which will help you improve your watercolor techniques and hopefully create some great-looking paintings. So this is the subject of my demonstration. As I say, part one of three demonstrations in this series. This is a little walk, a little pathway, promenade leading into the main town, Mykonos town. And we have here, dominant in the scene is this boat here, which has been placed on top of the rocks a bit unnaturally. It's I don't think it's a seafaring boat anymore, but in the distance we have an assortment of buildings on the hillside, some light catching the tops of some of those rooftops, different shades of blue and warm hints in those background buildings. I want to try and keep them sort of out of focus. I want to concentrate mainly on the middle ground and the foreground. And something I quite like with this scene is the this crazy paving. We call it, in the UK, we call it crazy paving. I'm not sure what you might call it in your location, but all of these random sizes of slabs laid down on this walkway, on this promenade. But we're looking against the light, which is a common thing I do, a contre-jour, which gives us some silhouetted shapes. Particularly notice the seating here, this wall, which I guess is seating. So light catching the tops, those light catching the top of the left-hand wall here as well. We've got a couple of figures, I'll change those. Not sure about the lamppost at the moment. That's sort of covering the boat. Nice bit of light hitting the bow, the front of the boat, and the stern likewise. Nice bit of light there as well, slither of light they want to keep in. Some horizontal little bits of light just sort of between the middle ground and the background. Now these square objects here, and particularly these longer benches in the foreground, I'm going to leave those out. As I say, I want to make more of a feature of the crazy paving. Try and render that as best I can in watercolor without painting in every single slab, which would drive me crazy and would be quite tortuous to watch. Just try and give an impression of the randomness and some of the mortar that you've got between the gaps there. Yes, so what to leave out, how to simplify the scene, particularly that background. Look how complicated it is. You could spend many hours trying to copy that exactly, all the shapes of the buildings and painting in all the windows and the different levels of the buildings and chimney tops as well. We've got to simplify that. So I'm going to try and do that as best I can. Give it a kind of out of focus sort of view. If we were taking a picture and we were zooming in, we were focusing on this boat here, maybe the background, if it was like a macro type shot, the background would be sort of out of focus. So let's see how we get on. So my first step is the outline drawing. I'm going to start with the skyline, the distant hill, and very loosely draw that in. there's some trees protruding out and the odd building or two. As I say, it's going to be out of focus in the distance there, not too much detail at all. Now, a key element of the composition is this boat, this red boat that's been hoisted out of the sea, and it's just stationary on the rocks. Not sure what it is, what purpose it's serving, but it is certainly quite a nice looking boat. I've changed the cabin. I've made the cabin a little bit simpler. I've changed it from what was in the scene, a sort of kind of stepped cabin, but I've made it more of a simpler box shape. And this is what we can do with painting, is that we're not trying to copy exactly the scene necessarily. We can make some subtle changes here and there to suit the composition. Now that cabin is just, the boat is kind of central, but the cabin being on the right of the center line, it kind of moves it slightly to the right. So it's nothing's too symmetrical, dead center in the middle of the picture. And then a bit of perspective with the 3 stone benches, that wall on the right hand side and the wall on the left. Get in a figure here, my first figure. Now I was thinking about putting a figure to the right of that, but from a composition point of view, I don't think it would look right too much in the middle of the scene. So I decided to just move it left of the central figure. So 2 figures. They're going to be light against a darker background. Very simply indicate where I want to have some buildings, a representation of some buildings, maybe a few horizontal lines where the light is catching the tops of those buildings. So here's the rocks down below. And just finish off these benches. Some tricky perspective angles to deal with. The top of the seats, the bottom of the seats, the right hand edge there. But they're certainly going to give a nice opportunity to get in some light and shade into the scene. There's a few horizontal lines just beyond the left-hand figure. I've just done a little bit of cross-hatching to define the face of that figure. And with these figures' legs, I've really done them very quickly, not paid too much attention to them all. To give a sense of movement, the way I do it is just to not have too much detail with the legs, certainly no feet, almost a little bit of lost and found. Very briefly, but concentrate on the heads and the body. Now back to the boat. As I say, on the stern and the bow have a little slither of light showing through, so I've tried to draw those in. Got the mast in as well, the main mast towards the front of the boat. And that is it really from a drawing point of view. Very simple, just concentrate on the main shapes, thinking about the composition and moving things around, not having anything in the dead center of the picture. And certainly for me, in this particular scene, not bothering painting in those central foreground benches. I just think they're too dominating in the scene, and I want to concentrate really on the crazy paving. I don't often pre-wet the paper, but I'm doing so with the skies so I can get a nice graded wash, quite dark at the top, coming lighter down towards the actual skyline, the top of the ridge of the hill in the background there, the town in the background. So I've pre-wetted it with a flat brush. I could have used a sponge. I don't often do this with paintings, but I just want to make sure this is an easier way to get in a graded wash. And I'm just letting, the paper is quite absorbent. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press, it's a medium texture paper, quite absorbent, and it does stay wet quite long. So just letting it dry out a bit. It's still got, if I look at it against the light, there's still a bit of a sheen on it. So it's not dried out too much. And then with a mop brush here, this is a Raphael soft aqua mop brush, as big as I can use in relation to the size of the paper. And then starting at the top, a bit of a wash of cerulean blue, a little bit of cobalt blue, and then going weaker down to the skyline. While it's still damp, going thicker on the top, so it's really going to be quite a range in values, quite dark at the top, light, almost showing the white paper through on the right hand side, just as the lower part of the skyline. So that's cobalt blue that I've got there in the middle. Let me go through the palette. So it's neutral tint at the top, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cobalt blue pretty much in the middle, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson I was just using there. Then I've got a bright red, which is a Windsor red, then a light red, and cadmium orange, two up from the bottom, and the lower one is lemon yellow. So after the sky, I'm now doing the background hills, but this is going to be the main colour of the buildings. I don't want them to be too light. I know they're white buildings, but if I leave the paper showing through it will actually make it look as if those buildings are closer than they are. So I want to dull them down a little bit. We are looking into the light, so that they are, a lot of them, they're in shade. The only light that we've got on the building is a bit of light catching the tops of those buildings, and then come a little bit stronger. As I come to the base of the hill, there is a sort of boom or whatever the nautical term is, a horizontal pole coming out from the mast. Somebody no doubt will correct me, someone that knows their nautical terms. Paint around the top of the cabin of the boat, which is going to be left unpainted. So this is the colour of the buildings, and I've deliberately changed my colours from blues and reds. I'm going quite dark. You might think, or I might think at the time, this is probably a little bit too dark, but things are going to dry lighter with watercolour. You've got to try and compensate for that, how light the paint is going to dry. Go darker than you think. This is a little bit of ultramarine blue and right at the base of the far building on the right hand side, some neutral tint which will travel up against gravity. There's a slight slope on this board of about 10% or so, so that there is a slight movement of the paint coming down the scene. Now, this is the left-hand side, left-hand building here, which, because things on the side, I don't want that to be the focus of any attention or any focal point. I want to try and just really paint in some basic shapes. Likewise with this bank on the left-hand side, where there's different types of vegetation coming down to the top of the wall, which I will leave white. So the background hills are still damp, and now I want to give this out of focus impression by going in with the darker greens around the far buildings, just to define those. And with this green, I need to be a bit careful not to have it too bright a green, like the green on the bank, for example. It's got to be more of a bluey green and darker than the undercoat of the buildings, and thicker as well. Thicker, so there's going to be less water to paint ratio here. And I'm mixing and mixing and mixing just to sense what would be a good colour to start with, and then start from the top left corner, so not in the middle. Start with the top left corner. I am right-handed, so there'd be less danger of smudging my work as well. And a quick little test, wasn't quite right, so go in again. Now I'm using a smaller mop brush. This is a size 2 Raphael soft aqua mop brush, and you'll just be able to sense that the skyline is getting a bit of a soft edge. It's not too hard because the sky is still quite damp. The sky is still quite damp, so there's a bit of travelling going on. And I'm coming to my first buildings now where I want to paint around these. So I'm actually mixing quite a few different colours here. Ultramarine blue, bit of cobalt, bit of viridian green, bit of burnt sienna, burnt umber. Now it's not going, I am mixing quite a few colours there, just experimenting till I think I've got quite a good combination. And it's not going to go muddy. A lot of people ask me with the colour mixing, how do you prevent things going a little bit muddy? And I think it's down to the quality of the paints that you're using. These are mainly Winsor Newton. The neutral tint is a Daniel Smith. I wish I could afford Daniel Smith, but being in the UK, it's a little bit more expensive than Winsor and Newton. But they're good quality, professional grade paints. Going a bit darker towards the bottom of the hill. There's some buildings there at the bottom of the hill. Now, I don't want the edges around these buildings to be too hard. I want them to be soft, so I might need to drop in a little bit of water or do a bit of lifting out to diffuse it a little bit and mix things around, blend them a bit more before things dry too before things dry too much. Continue on down to the right, so we've got this sort of gentle slope of the hill. I suppose I'm doing this background quite quickly, which I need to do. If I spent too much time doing it, I would be spending a lot of time with attention to detail, which I don't want to do. There's a little palm tree, a date palm, with that fan shape of leaves. Yeah, so trying to do this as quickly as I can, and just define a few random buildings all over there, all over the far side. I'm using the fingertips to smudge things and merge paint together. It's all still quite damp. Even within the buildings, there's different range of values, some subtle changes from the top of the building to the bottom of the building, or maybe on the left-hand side of the buildings. So when I look at it now, the range of values from the colour of the value of the buildings to the trees is too wide a range. I need to dull them down a little bit, which I'll do in a minute. That's a bit of a canopy here, and a column, a supporting column at the front of that overhang. So a little bit of negative painting to define that column. Now it's a bit drier there, so I've got a harder edge, which it doesn't matter. It's nice to get a mixture of soft edges and hard edges. Coming down to the middle ground now, there are some far buildings and tops of walls. This pathway takes some twists and turns around the bay into the main town, but we just got some light hitting the tops of walls and so on, and then going around this figure, caressing around that figure just to bring that out. And that's going to be I'm going to leave that figure quite light against the background. So I've painted around carefully the head and the uppermost part of the body. So I'm darkening down now some of these buildings. They were too light in my mind, and that has the effect of perhaps well, maybe it looking a little bit closer than it should be, but also drawing your attention to those buildings. So I've deliberately picked up some water, and this is my way of doing it. I could have done a bit of splattering, some controlled splattering. I might need to cover up some of the paper before doing that, but as you can see here, it was all still damp. Using good quality paper, things are moving around, and watercolor is doing what it does. It's blending, traveling, giving us different edges, and if I'm patient enough just to let that dry, it's going to dry lighter. That's the far beach, mainly yellow ochre. Now, I've got a different mop brush here. This is a natural hair mop brush, and I need this to be quite soft to do the water. There's a little bit of, or quite a bit of light touching, glistening on the surface of the water, and I want to give an impression of the light just catching a little bit of some of those waves. And the way I'm doing, I'm using the side of this natural mop brush, left to right or right to left. I could have gone in one direction. I'm doing a bi-directional flow here, going down. And because there's not too much paint on the brush, it's not too wet. I'm using the brush at a shallow angle, and I've got roughish paper. It's giving me just a few little speckles of light there. Now I'm coming a bit darker towards the foreground and defining the edge of those benches, and then just leave it. Resist the temptation of going back into that sea and mucking about with it, because it will only go wrong. Now with the same brush, this is a Jackson's squirrel mop brush. I think this is a size 10, and the cabin, the side of the cabin facing us, is almost a similar value to the far buildings, but because we've got a light around it, it doesn't. Well, I've blended it in with the background hills on the left hand side, but kept a little bit of a light edge on the right, where the light is. Maybe the light is just slightly over to the right hand side. And now the hull of the boat, which is a dark red, but I've got to come darker as I come down towards the bottom of the hull. And like the left hand figure, the central figure painted around that. Go right up to the back of the boat, and I'll get the rudder in separately, which I haven't drawn in, but I know in my mind I know where it's going to be. Right, define the front of the boat, the bow, continue on around that central figure, come a bit darker as I go down, alizarin crimson, bit of ultramarine blue there, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, combination of those, quite thick. With a mop brush, it does hold a fair bit of moisture, so you don't have to keep going back into your water well and replenish it. It does enable you to keep working for quite some time without having to go back in there. And with watercolor, you've got to keep going with it. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to stop a phase and go off and do something else. You've got to keep. It's a continuous thing. Now the rudder, quite dark against the lighter background. So this boat, for whatever reason, is high and dry up on the rocks. down to the base of the boat, wheel. I'm now painting around some far benches. So that's defined, that little horizontal bit of light there, that's defined a smaller seat, and there's just a fourth. I've got these three major benches on the right hand side, but that's a small little one just coming out at a different angle. So that one's sort of pointing bottom left to top right, and then most of the others are top left to bottom right, so it's a slightly different angle. So these rocks, I went a bit too dark there, so I immediately added a bit more water. It's got to be lighter than the hull of the boat, and I'm going to be going in, after this is dried, I'm going to be going in with a smaller brush, darker colour, to create the form of the little cracks and layers on these rocks. So that's defined the edge, the right-hand edge of those benches quite well. It's not too bad. What I'm doing now is, with a paper towel, just lifting out little parts of that background hill. It's still fairly damp, hasn't dried totally yet, so I've got an opportunity of lifting out. Now I could have done that with a damp brush, a damp mop brush, but I've used a paper towel with a kind of smooth flat edge to it, so crumple it up a little bit and just lift off some of the excess moisture. Now this is the left hand retaining wall. Before doing this wall, I could have laid down a weak wash for the crazy paving promenade. I'm going to do that after this, but I could have done that first. In fact, most people probably would have done that first, because you are, with watercolor, you are painting from light to dark, so that being a lighter shade, you probably would have laid down the road surface first, but I've done it now. So these figures start with the heads, perhaps some very brief brush marks to indicate one or two legs, and now their tops of the bodies, and I've left a bit of light on their shoulders, so this one I'll have a dark top and a lighter shorts or whatever, and then the left hand figure lighter the top, darker down towards the bottom, and hopefully painting those in quite quickly. I've got a sense of movement. They're slightly different pose, each of these two figures, different angle, and not spending too much time painting the legs. A sense of movement. Right, now this is what I was talking about, the crazy paving and light further away, coming darker down towards us. It will dry lighter, and with this brush, very quickly rendering in the promenade, leaving out little bits of paper, dry brush marks. And then when this is dry, I'll paint in some of the mortar between the slabs just to define some of those slabs. Not all of them. If I did all of them, it would just look too much in your face, and it wouldn't look right. But I just do a few. A bit like doing when you're painting any brick wall. You're not going to paint in every single brick if that's, if you want to paint in an impressionistic way. So just a few bricks, just a few markings of one layer of bricks to another. I've got the hairdryer out now to make sure everything is dry before going on to the next step. Next step is, well, picking up a smaller brush now, a smaller synthetic round brush for more of the details. And I'm going to start with the rocks first of all. This brush has got a good point to it, a nice point, so I can just, I'm almost drawing in these little cracks between the rocks where there's some dark shade in there. I need to, at the bottom of the hole, connect with the rudder and a bit of shadow on the rocks. You can see right at the top of my palette, I'm mixing in my darks up there. Generally with those three mixing wells, I mix the darks in the top mixing well. The middle one would generally be the cools because it's close to those blues, and then the bottom one are the warms, reds, because I've got all my reds and oranges down there. Just to the right of the yellow, I sometimes mix in greens there for foliage, so I've got the yellow there, might mix it with a blue, for example, in a smaller mixing well there. Just between, I've got some lavender, you might just detect towards the bottom right some lavender, so just between those, that's where I mix a lot of the greens. So with this brush, I'm now going around the scene, over to the background hills. Maybe there's some people on the beach. They're just defined as a very simple little brush mark. Now windows, as I was saying with bricks, not every single window, and when I'm doing the windows, not strict square or rectangles, just some quick, brief brush marks. There's not too much water on this brush. For these darks, I'm using neutral tint in combination with something else. So ultramarine blue, for example, is quite a common one I would do, or maybe burnt sienna and neutral tint, or alizarin crimson and neutral tint. Just mixing those two up. Not a lot of water, dry brush marks. Just an impression of a few distant buildings. I will get out some white paint to define some of the rooftops a bit more. I could have painted around some horizontal lines in the distance, but because it was all quite damp, I was moving quite quickly, that would have been fairly difficult to do. So a little bit easier as a later stage to, with some white paint and a brush, well, this brush, for example, get in some horizontals to define the rooftops, just a few. As I say, this is going to be the first of 3 paintings on Mykonos, the island of Mykonos, and the next one I'm going to be going into the middle of town and paint a small fish market. So, and that might be released in a few days after this one. So please subscribe to get notifications of the next release, and it does, by subscribing, it does send a little discreet message to Google that you might appreciate this video. So it's always good to subscribe to creators that you appreciate and just to give them a bit of a thumbs up. You can also support me on Patreon. You might have heard of Patreon. This is a platform for creators to, in a more interactive way, in a closer way, share content with you. And I've got up on Patreon, I post exclusive content that's not available. I can't actually share with you on YouTube. So there's opportunities for me to, with the little community I've created on Patreon, to create some monthly projects. And this month we've got a bridge painting project. So every month I set these projects, and depending on what tier, with Patreon you've got different tiers, so whatever kind of involvement you want, whether it's just fairly passive or more active, there's different tiers, as they call it, different levels of membership. And depending on what membership you take part in these monthly projects, and you do your painting, and then you submit them to me. You send a photo of your painting to me, and on a few of these tiers I actually give you then a critique back. It might be a written critique, a brief written critique. It might be a more in-depth video critique of a few minutes, just really me trying to help you and giving my 2 cents. It is, these critiques, they're always personal, and I always try to have some positives to mention on a critique, but also to be true, to be honest myself and my particular feeling on the painting as regards maybe how the perspective went on a street scene, or your figure work, or the values, or watercolor techniques, brush techniques as well. We cover everything. So if you want more information, please go up to Patreon, which is patreon.com/ so that's bottom left to top right / Tim Wilmot, TimWilmot. Yeah, look forward to you being out there. We also have regular Q&As as well up there. So I try to make it as interactive as possible. This interactive Q&A, which you can't do on YouTube, and just allows me to be a bit more interactive with those people that want to get involved. So now crazy paving time, and I'm just sort of defining some of the gaps there with this brush, which if I press more, I'm going to get a thicker line. If I don't press so much, I get a thinner line, more narrow. Just a hint of a few lines in the distance. Don't want too many because that's where the light is. I've got some bright light there in the distance and some darker, thicker lines to help with the perspective down towards the foreground. So when I observe the crazy paving, there are a few darker marks in there, so I've indicated that. Now, time for some vertical masks. So I've got a bit of dried up white gouache in the very bottom right corner. I've mixed in some lavender, which again is quite opaque. So these masks, they're not white, they're kind of off-white. They're in my mind, that lavender is a good sort of replication of their colour and value, and I've mixed a sort of pasty combination of white gouache and this lavender to continue the mast up into the sky. So it's good to connect with verticals, the different areas of the scene, the background with the middle ground, with the foreground. And so these verticals, they could be street lights, they could be masts in a harbour scene. They're good excuse to get in those forms of connection. A darker horizontal in the middle ground, around that light figure, up to the bow of the boat, and again a mark. There's quite a few markings along the top of the hull, so and some of them are quite light, but I'm just make it easier for myself with a darker line. I could have, if I did want a lighter line, I could have used a weaker white gouache and just gone over that with this thin brush when everything was quite dry, which it is drying up quite a lot now. That's some railings across the along the top of the gunnel of the boat, the top edge of that boat. Going to have a bit more dark from that left-hand figure, almost connecting that with the boat. I think it needed it. Cover up that white bit there to the right of that left-hand figure. The cabin, perhaps a window. Painting a few horizontals for these buildings, just a few, not too many, and not continuous lines as well. So this brush doesn't have a lot of water on it. I'm just dragging it quickly. They're dry brush marks. There's some gaps in these horizontal lines as well. Let's get in an impression of a yucca or an agave cactus plant growing on the bank. But it's just going to be a few brush marks, just giving the impression of something up there. Define the sides of the mast a bit more. With the distant buildings, I'm going in a little bit darker around that mast. So I now need to get in some highlights with white paint, excuse me, some white paint, and I'm going to be using the same brush as I used for the darks I've just done. What I'm doing now off camera is cleaning that brush, making sure there's no bits of black left or bits of neutral tint left in it to contaminate my white paint. So I do take the white paint I use. Actually, it's called a hybrid. It's from, I said that all the paints I use are from Winsor and Newton or Daniel Smith, but this one is a Shinhan, excuse me, and this is a combination. I haven't found it anywhere else, but it's called a hybrid of watercolor and gouache. So to me, it's a bit like gouache, but I'm taking it straight out the tube. And this tube is a 20mm tube I use, and I think it's lasted about 2 or 3 years now. So, and I'm generally using it towards the end just to pick up on a few more highlights of tops of buildings, rigging on the boat, maybe a little bit of highlighting around some of the figures, not too much, some discrete verticals as well, doing a bit of minor, as I was describing before, a bit of minor connecting of the different horizontal elements of the scene. And the rigging, not a continuous line, lost and found again. Certainly the buildings I'm doing now, they need a little bit of highlight on the tops just to strengthen them looking a bit more realistic as buildings, as far buildings. Bit of white on the top of the rudder. There's a bit of rigging at the back of the boat and a bit of the railing. So I'm looking at the picture now thinking, do I need to add anything more to it? And when I can't think of anything else to add to it, that then is the sort of end of the process. I will use a rubber to an eraser to take out some of the pencil lines in the areas of paper that are still showing, just to make it a little bit crisper, some of those edges. So this is the finished painting. Some of the colours do look a little bit different because this is truer to the actual end painting. It's the photograph was taken with a different camera than what I used for recording the video, so apologies for that. But the first painting in a series of 3 from Mykonos. Please stick around for the next video, or subscribe to get notification of these new videos. But my take on simplifying the scene, what to leave out, talking about composition as well, and discussing lots of different watercolor techniques. The graded wash of the sky, quite dark at the top, coming lighter down towards the skyline. The ridge of the far hillside there. Then that background, trying to be out of focus, so not having too many hard edges around the edges of the buildings. Very loosely painted, indication of a few windows and horizontals and verticals, just to give the impression of the far side there, and that's that palm tree was very quickly done. And then the focus was on the middle ground and these figures, but this red boat located up on the cliffs here, the rocks, and the left-hand side sort of coming down to the boat. So that angle there, I think, is quite nice from a composition point of view. It's sort of leading the eye down to this scene, and then the slight curvature of the boat, bit of light hitting the bow and the stern, and then these 2 figures. I didn't copy the figures from the photograph. I could have, they were all right, but I just chose to have these 2 figures in, and a bit of contre-jour. We're looking into the light. So we've got these in my mind, quite pleasing in a contre-jour scene, bits of light against a dark background. So the light figure against a dark background, and the dark shadows on the lighter crazy paving. The crazy paving to me was one of the things I wanted to try and portray. So hopefully I've sort of pulled that off in a way to give that indication. Yeah, hope you like it. So stick around, or hope to see you on part 2 or 3 when we go closer into Mykonos and the fish market.